Hello everyone, welcome to another video in our Security Plus and Security Essentials series. Today we're going to have a look at indicators of malicious activity. Now if you're new to the series, drop a sub, bookmark the playlist, throw a like if you enjoy it, and then we'll get cracking. So the first section we're going to cover is malware attacks and indicators of these malware attacks. And we'll start out with some of the more commonly known malware classifications, just to make sure you're all clear on what is a virus, what is a worm, and so forth. So first up, let's tackle what is a virus. Well, it's the thing that the user is going to say that their computer has, no matter what the problem seems to be. But a virus is a very specific kind of malware, where it is going to infect an existing host file, and it requires a human trigger. Something the user must do. Whether that action is downloading an infected file, inserting an infected USB flash drive, or running an infected program, it is a human-driven trigger that launches a virus. Once launched, the virus will then proceed to spread to new systems and do some malicious action, which will obviously vary depending on what the malware developer intended for this malware to be able to do. Now, please note the two key characteristics I mentioned. It attaches to a file or program of some kind, which means we can separate it, and it requires a human trigger. Because a worm, very similar to a virus, spreads and causes harm, except there's two key differences. The first one is that a worm is a self-contained file, which means that we cannot separate the worm from something like we can with a virus. We can only destroy a worm. And a worm is self-triggering. As soon as it's on your system, it can begin executing and do its nasty thing. Oh dear. So those are the two main kinds of autonomous malware that we get. Then we also have Trojans, or Trojan horses if you prefer the longer name. Now for those of you familiar with the story of the Greeks invading the city of Troy, you know where the name comes from, and can probably make a very good guess about why we chose this name of all possible names. But for those of you who are not quite sure why we chose this name, well, with a Trojan horse or Trojan malware, what happens is somebody will take a legitimate application of some kind and embed some malicious code into it. The victim will then install the application and use it, and more than likely ignore any warnings their anti-malware might give them. Wait, why would somebody ignore the anti-malware warning? Well, very simply put, many attackers will use pirated software as a way of delivering Trojan horse malware onto a target system, as most people would probably ignore any warnings, as, well, it's probably just a way that they got around the licensing and the security that would have been enforced. Then a fairly new name in our vernacular, PUA, or potentially unwanted application. You'll hear this term thrown around quite a lot nowadays, and there are one of two ways you land up with potentially unwanted applications. The first one is where you purchased a computer from a retailer and it comes with some software pre-installed that you don't want, or probably do not want. The alternative way of getting PUA, or potentially unwanted applications, is when you're downloading and installing something. The installer might have something you don't want ticked by default, and you've just clicked your way through and accidentally installed that thing. PUAs themselves, or potentially unwanted applications, are not necessarily malicious, but they do have one massive issue, and that is it is software that you didn't intend to install, and that software could be adding vulnerabilities or causing problems for you that you did not foresee. Then we have logic bombs. Logic bombs are going to sound very similar to worms and viruses, but there is a key difference. So first of all, logic bombs are deployed by the attacker, usually in a manual fashion. They're not really designed to spread on their own, and that's where one of the big differences comes in. And the logic bomb will sit there and wait for a logical condition to be met. What that logical condition is, well, that will vary. But it can be a human action or a technical trigger, such as the time of the day or a particular service executing. And once it receives that trigger, the logic bomb goes off and does its malicious thing. Think of it as the malware equivalent of a landmine, just sitting there waiting for someone to trigger it. Now, generally they get used for either countering forensics and deleting the records and logs that might be left behind by the attacker when the investigators get too close, or they could be part of a grander attack such as skimming less than a cent off of a transaction on a transaction processing system. Nonetheless though, logic bombs are normally part of a human-driven attack. But we've got a fairly new kind of malware on the horizon now, and that is fileless malware. Now, fileless malware usually is for remote execution, so that the attacker can control the malware from afar. And it normally is going to be a memory residency payload that gets delivered onto your system. Whoa, that's a heavy one. So what will happen is it's going to get launched from conventional malware. And once it is sitting in RAM, the conventional malware can be caught and removed, but the malicious payload is now sitting in your memory. And it'll stay there and continue to exist for as long as it can. Now, once it's in the memory, it can do things like establishing some persistence via modifying registry entries, so that even if you do reboot your machine, it's going to be back again after the next reboot. And to avoid detection by anti-malware, this stuff is designed to live off the land. In other words, using tools, utilities, and commands that are present on your system, but doing so in a way that is malicious. It's quite crafty if you think about it, because it's in RAM, and most anti-malware doesn't actively scan RAM, it looks more at your permanent storage. And then add to that, it's often delivered by something that's meant to get caught. And once you've got rid of that thing that was meant to be caught, you're less likely to look for the fileless malware. And then the really smart designers of this stuff, they'll make sure it's got low observable characteristics. They'll ensure that the malicious actions take place slowly and in a way that is less likely to draw attention both of the human user, the security professionals, and the digital anti-malware solutions. Oh dear, dear, dear. This is going to be a challenge to deal with. Thankfully though, a lot of our anti-malware solutions and endpoint protection platforms are now starting to scan memory and are getting definitions and heuristic signatures to deal with fileless malware. But we also need to worry about malware that is spying on us or just being a general nuisance. Let's start out with the easy one, spyware. With spyware, its goal is to monitor local activity on your computer. Often it's either going to be trying to grab keyboard entry or screen activity. Those two are the most commonly spied upon activities done by an end user. And given the choice, I probably would go for the keyboard entries because I can do quite a lot to figure out what you're up to based on your typing. But your screen activity is equally useful. Now, one of the things the malware has to do if it wants to be spyware is it's going to have to record that data and store it somewhere or transmit it. Now, in the case of key logging or keyboard monitoring, it's easy to store or transmit because it is text data, so it doesn't take up much space on the storage drive or much space on the network as far as bandwidth consumption is concerned. And then with the screen recording, spyware, it does take up a bit more storage and does take up a bit more bandwidth, as obviously it is trying to transmit pictures or video, which is far more storage hungry and far more bandwidth intensive. So we can pick up on the screen recording malware that way. However, the keyboard monitoring is easier to detect itself. Our operating systems and our anti-malware solutions are quite well optimized at detecting this attempt. So that's a bit of good news for us. Then we have adware. Adware is essentially annoying advertising. The idea is it's going to push advertising onto your computer, either as an application that pops up and just pushes adverts in front of you, or by maybe messing with your browser settings to make sure that an advertising platform is your browser's home page whenever you launch it. Now, the normal way to get adware onto a victim system is to get it bundled with some sort of free software. Again, either as something that you accidentally downloaded while downloading the installer, or something that was ticked by default during the installation wizard. This is why we often tell people to try not be careless when they're installing something, because you get into this habit of click, 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 I agree, install through an installation wizard. And that's how adware is designed to get into your system, is taking advantage of that behavior. What you want to be doing is whenever you're installing something, click, look what's at the screen. Click, look what's on the screen. Click, look what's on the screen. Don't just hit next, next, next unless you are very, 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 very familiar with the application, and still get used to the number of clicks you're making, because if it increases, well, that should definitely grab your attention. Thankfully though, adware is only really annoying. It's not going to necessarily report on your activity or mess with your system stability, but it is definitely going to eat up resources and become very frustrating, as the ads are probably not going to be targeted adverts, nor the most pleasant and polite things being advertised. So you definitely want to try and avoid having that on your system. In extreme cases, you might have to completely reinstall the operating system to get rid of it. Thankfully, that doesn't happen very often anymore, but it is something you do need to consider. And then we also need to worry about remote access malware. With remote access malware, it's all about having a backdoor into the system. It will either enable a backdoor by installing a service or a feature that was normally off by default. And then the alternative is to use a backdoor that's already on the system and just requires the right thing to use it. Now, if it's a pre-existing backdoor, that might have either been done by a developer intentionally or accidentally, but nonetheless, though, it does allow access to a system. Now, a very popular way to achieve a backdoor is to use a remote access Trojan. A Trojan horse designed specifically to enable backdoor access into a system, so that the attacker may remotely access the target system. Often, they will make sure that it is going to be embedded into a functional piece of software that the victim is likely to keep around. Think of things like MS Office. That would be a very useful tool to target. Thankfully, though, it's not likely that MS Office would be targeted, but I'm just giving you the idea that something you probably would keep on your machine all the time would be a good option for an attacker to include remote access Trojans into. Now, one of the common characteristics of a lot of remote access Trojans is that there'll be some sort of command and control communications, either for your system to take part in a DDoS botnet, or to let the attacker know the malware was successfully installed and they can now target the system. One interesting thing as well is that remote access Trojan malware will usually use something that is not a remote desktoping tool, as we don't want the victim to notice a second remote graphic session being launched. We would rather, if we were the attacker, favor something command line based, where it's very minimal on the network and the resources and unlikely to draw the user's attention unless we're messing with the files they're currently looking at. But even that's not the scariest kind of malware. You should really be scared of this. A rootkit. What a rootkit does is it's going to elevate whatever user account the attacker has access to have administrative privileges. These admin privileges can then be used to do whatever the attacker wants to do. And it is normally done by a human-driven attack, either on-prem or remote, it doesn't make much difference. And it can be used to just do what the attacker wants. Give themselves an account, enable a feature, whatever, you name it. If it would require admin rights, a rootkit would be the perfect tool for the attacker to elevate a standard user account, or worse yet, a guest account. And the way rootkits usually work is they'll either replace key files that are part and parcel of the authorization checking system, or we would just hide the administrative activity done by the attacker from any authorization validation process. And just to add a little bit of chaos to the mix, they often purge log records that would indicate that a standard user has been doing administrative tasks. And because of rootkits, this is why most operating systems have their default guest accounts disabled by default. Which is a very sensible choice, as the default guest accounts can only ever be called guest. They usually don't allow you to put a password on them, and if the attacker successfully launches a rootkit, well, now that guest account can do administrative actions. So thankfully, rootkits are less common nowadays, but still are a common concern. Another issue as well with rootkits is that they are very good at hiding activity, and they hide themselves as well, which is one of the reasons why a good endpoint protection platform or anti-malware solution will have continuous security monitoring so that it can pick up on the presence of a rootkit before it has a chance to launch, and start hiding its trail. Now for a more noticeable kind of malware infection, cryptographic malware. And the most noticeable will be ransomware. Ransomware is where the malware comes along and encrypts all your data. Wait, isn't encryption a good thing? Well, that depends. Do you control the encryption process of your own data? In other words, do you have the decryption key for your data? If so, that's good. But if somebody else has the decryption key for your data, that could be quite bad, especially when that person wants payment for the decryption key. So that is where the threat comes in. They take your data hostage by encrypting it and demand payment for access to the decryption key. The problem is, though, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to get the decryption key even if you do pay them. The WannaCry attacks that happened several years back that put ransomware on the map for a lot of people, there was no way for the attackers to associate your payment with the appropriate decryption key, so they just didn't bother giving the decryption keys out. A few months after that, there was a second attack called CompTIA that was based on WannaCry, and the attackers didn't even have the ability to determine what decryption keys could have been used, never mind who they would be belonging to. So there is zero guarantee when dealing with ransomware attackers that you will get your data back. What's even worse is the craftier attackers will make sure that their ransomware is present on your system for a long time before letting it trigger. That way there is a better chance that it infects your backups, so that if you try to recover from your backup so you don't have to deal with the ransomware attacker, they just have to re-trigger the malware that you've accidentally brought back in your recovery media. Quite frustrating. Now, a common hallmark of many ransomware attacks is that they do tend to use cryptocurrencies for payment. As with cryptocurrencies, as long as the wallet address is not on an exchange, it is very difficult to track where the transaction of the cryptocurrency went to. And because it is a digital token, the laundering of the cryptocurrency can be very effective. Now, speaking of cryptocurrencies, let's talk about crypto mining malware. So with cryptocurrency mining, this is the reward you get for maintaining the blockchain that is used by whatever cryptocurrency in question. And it is a very process-intensive activity. To do cryptocurrency mining, you normally need either very specialized hardware or very powerful computer hardware, both of which cost a lot of money and draw a lot of power. Now, for people who do cryptocurrency mining legitimately, they have to do a cost calculation to determine whether the electrical expense that they're incurring by running that powerful hardware is equal to or less than the value of the cryptocurrency that they are trying to mine. If not, it's not worth running the mining resources to make some money. But if the attacker can use your computing power, whether it's strong or not, and use your electricity, whether it's cheap or not, doesn't matter, it's pure profit for them, because it costs them nothing apart from getting the malware onto your system. The really sneaky attackers will normally make sure that the crypto mining malware is not going to take over your whole machine and only borrow a little bit of the processing resources, so they get your machine contributing to their work for a longer period of time. It's quite annoying. But the good news is all types of malware do tend to leave some sort of indicators of their malicious activity. So what kind of red flags should we be on the lookout for? Well, a sudden change to your browser, and you did not recently add any extensions or plugins, and when you checked, there were no major updates from the vendor who maintains your browser. That is normally a very strong indicator of adware and spyware. Another thing you could do is files that you suspect of being malicious, trigger them in a sandboxed environment and see what they do. This will allow you to determine both whether the thing is malicious or not, and also, if it is malicious, what are its characteristics, behaviors, and what does it try and access and affect. This can be very, very useful. Another thing as well is if you see higher than normal resource consumption on a computer, then definitely worth looking into. But always remember, when you're looking at resource consumption as an indicator for malware or any sort of security-based threat, you do need to factor in things like time of the day, what might be going on in the system in the background, stuff like that. For instance, Windows installation of an update could take up a lot of resources and make the computer, CPU, and memory seem busier than normal. But if there are no apparent updates being installed, then big indicator that something abnormal is taking place. If you come across any locked content in your file system, like encrypted files, big red flag that you've probably been hit by ransomware. Or a resource has become inaccessible. When the ransomware takes over, or any sort of malware takes over, a particular processing resource and does not give it back up to the operating system. Very, very likely to be malware in that case. And if you see any weird activity from a user account, that might be an indicator that the account is compromised and malware was either used in the compromising of it or is being ran from that account. And if you're doing some log reviews and you see that some logs are missing or incomplete, also a very big red flag that there might be some sort of malware running on the system. There are loads of other malware indicators as well, but one of the things you always want to keep in mind is whenever you are looking at something that does hint at there being malware on the system, when it's not so obvious, always try and find a more reasonable explanation, and assuming none can be found, then you start with the malware investigation. Now let's move on to network and physical attack indicators and what we could do about them. So let's start out easy with some physical network attack indicators. First up, let's check out the physical denial of service. Wait, a physical denial of service? Yes. If I can gain physical access to something in your environment and prevent it from working, that is going to be as effective as any kind of network-based denial of service attack. Years ago, I had an experience where I was working at an organization as a contractor, and to get to their kitchen area, it was a bit of a crazy maze in their building just to make yourself a cup of coffee. And then to get back to the work area, it was equally confusing. And at some point, I must have got turned around and found myself in their server room. Now, what's so bad about that? Remember, I went to go make myself a cup of coffee. And the scary thing is, I'm now in the server room with an open container of liquid. Well, honestly, it doesn't even matter if it was an open container. Any liquid in a server room is a bad idea, because all it would take for me is to pour that cup of coffee over the server, and that could have taken the thing offline. That kind of stuff could be dreadfully affecting the organization's ability to operate normally. Also, attackers will try and plant rogue devices wherever they can. This is why we try and keep as much of our networking equipment in cabinets and racks as possible to make it harder to plant the rogue hardware. Admittedly, the locks on a lot of networking cabinets and server racks are not the most secure, but we also try and make sure that they're difficult to access. You'll probably notice that anytime you have a networking cabinet in a user area, we often have it mounted quite high up the wall so that you need a stepladder or have to balance very precariously on top of an office chair to try and gain access to it. And with server racks, we normally keep them in secure rooms or buildings where there is little to no foot traffic and all access is very carefully logged and controlled. But the attacker could always go after something that controls the environment. If the attacker could, they would mess with the HVAC system for a server room or office building to make it overheat, or possibly interfere with power and water supply to the building to make it less likely to work properly. Wait, the water supply? Yes, if the water supply to a premises is interrupted, a lot of people will move to work from home so that they can go to the toilet and wash their hands and whatever else it is they're going to need water for while working. This means less physical people on site, less likely for the attacker to be identified and caught. Or maybe the attacker would like as many people present as possible so they can try and do RFID skimming and cloning of people's access cards. What is absolutely terrifying here is a lot of you are thinking, but don't these cards need to be put very close to the sensor? And yes, they do. But you can get RFID scanners that do work from a significant distance away. I remember seeing a garage door system where the motor would open as soon as it detected an RFID access card in the owner's vehicle pulling up into the driveway. That scanner must have some pretty decent range, and the electronics required for that scanner to work could be disassembled and easily fit in a backpack. All the attacker now needs to do is walk around the environment and be within a few meters and thus be able to see the access card that the user is carrying. This is quite concerning. And then they can obviously clone it or reproduce the signal and reaction that the access card creates when exposed to an electromagnetic frequency. Then we have our pure network attacks and the indicators of them. Now, most real attackers will do some sort of reconnaissance before they attack you. Before they do anything that's noticeable, they'll do what we call passive reconnaissance or passive footprinting of the organization, where they will learn about the organization that they want to target with freely available intelligence and information that is on the internet. And we will have very little way of identifying people that are just browsing our website or looking at news articles about our organization. But at some point, the attacker will then decide to continue and actively start scanning and determining what is present on your network. The good news for us is they will be engaging with our public-facing assets and resources, and hopefully they make the mistake of engaging and scanning them in a way that is not natural for an ordinary public user or customer to engage with. For instance, somebody accessing the website and then sending an email to us is pretty normal. But somebody accessing the web server and then checking all open and listening TCP/IP ports is not natural communication. Nor is the same thing then occurring on our email server normal or natural. So that at least gives the attacker away a little bit. Then we have denial of service attacks, ordinary denial of service attacks. With a denial of service, the attacker is normally going to do something that is going to affect the ordinary operations of a server. This might be trying to invoke the server through a network request to do something that would cause it to freeze and possibly even reboot. Alternatively, the attacker might just try and open a bunch of sessions and not actually finish the session setup or the TCP three-way handshake that is usually done. The good news though for us is that denial of service attacks are by definition a single source attack, where it comes from one place. And we just need to be able to identify that malformed and malicious activity and then block that source. In fact, most enterprise networking equipment already does this. So we don't actually have to worry too badly about it, but we still want to check that we are able to identify and block ordinary single source denial of service attacks. Because our bigger challenge when it comes to denial of service are DDoS attacks or distributed denial of service attacks, which we'll talk a bit about later on in this video. But for now, let's talk about the network attacks being used to deliver a malicious payload. Very common will be to use some sort of a loud communication to get some malware onto a victim system, or some sort of weaponized exploit that can then be used to either garner access or get the system to behave in a way that is not desirable for us and our security. That payload might be something that allows the attacker to control and coordinate our system in conjunction with a bunch of other compromised systems so that they have this global distributed network of computers that are doing processing on their behalf. That will now make you part of a botnet. The good news with command and control traffic is either it is very, very easy to detect or it is very difficult for the attacker to use. But it'll probably be difficult for us to detect as well. So working our way through that, a easy to control method would be using IRC or Internet Relay Chat, which is a protocol used on chat rooms on the early internet back in the 90s and early 2000s. Thankfully, IRC chat room use is very uncommon nowadays, and we would probably notice that protocol running through our network very easily. Chances are as well, if your firewall is doing an implicit block, then you're probably not allowing the IRC communications through, which is good. Alternatively, the attacker might move to something like HTTP or DNS, which would be stuff that you do let through your firewall, but they are less well suited to issuing instructions and coordinating activities amongst the botnet. Add to that as well, seeing that kind of network activity at an unusual time of the day when most users are at home, or it's just not at work at the very least, would probably be a big red flag for us to keep our eyes open for. Admittedly, yes, the system has now been part of a botnet for a while, but if we pick up on some strange network activity after hours, that could be all we need to know that our environment is compromised. And then the attackers love our networks because it gives them the option to do lateral movement. With lateral movement, the attacker is looking at gaining access to a device that is not well secured and using any access or trust that device has with other devices to then gain access to those. They also might try and pivot around the devices they're laterally moving. Pivoting around involves the attacker changing up the protocol and the attack methodology when they're going from device A to device B, as device B might trust certain protocols and communications from device A, and the attackers can take advantage of all of that. They could also then use our network to exfiltrate data from our environment. And again, the attackers will often use protocols and services that are pretty normal and likely to actually be used within your network. But again, the mistake the attackers often make is they will send the data to environments or even countries that we do not normally use. And if they're not careful, they might use a time of the day when people are not at work, making the larger volume of network activity seem far more noticeable. But it can be very, very stealthy and subtle still. Then, for a large-scale network attack, let's talk about a disputed denial of service attack, where the attacker does need a botnet to coordinate via a command and control server to launch a denial of service attack against us. Now, what makes DDoS effective is the volume of the traffic can often overwhelm our network or the target systems that the attackers are after. In many cases, DDoS will usually use the same denial of service tactics that ordinary single source denial of service will use, but the sheer volume makes it more likely to be effective, thus rendering an entire system or possibly even the whole organization unusable and unavailable. A very common tactic is to try and either eat up all of the resources on a system in a SYN flood, where the attacker sends synchronization requests from their botnet to the victim. The victim acknowledges and requests to synchronize back, but the nodes in the botnet refuse to acknowledge the return synchronization message, causing the server to hold that session open temporarily. Thankfully nowadays most servers don't keep those sessions open for long, but with a large enough volume of nodes in the botnet, the attacker can be very effective here. Alternatively, the attacker could look at doing what's called a reflected DDoS attack, where the attacker gains access to your network somehow, spoofs or impersonates the victim's IP address, and sends a request to a bunch of systems within your network, hoping that they all reply at the same time, and because they did intentionally a bad job at spoofing the source identifier, the responses to the requests go back to the original real identity holder. This is a reflected attack. The good news is that they are very much harder to achieve, and as long as the attacker is unable to coordinate all of the other nodes to do it simultaneously, odds are our network will probably cope pretty well. But if they amplify this by using a botnet to impersonate the victim, they can send loads of requests, with each botnet pretending to be the victim system, making the reflected responses way more in terms of network count, traffic volume, and file data. Then, another common tactic for messing with your network is to do what's called an on-path attack. These used to be called man-in-the-middle attacks, but now we've rebranded it to be an on-path attack, which I do appreciate as it is very good at describing how it works. The attacker will try and physically or logically insert themselves between two communicating nodes, either by physically having a rogue device between the two entities, or logically by forcing routing or something similar to redirect traffic to a malicious node. So we would have two legitimate entities like a client and a server busy communicating, and the attacker, as I said, either physically or logically inserts himself in between the entities that are communicating. And while talking to the client, the attacker can pretend to be the server. And while talking to the server, the attacker can pretend to be the client. Our first and big risk here is that there is the chance the attacker can intercept the data being transmitted. Even in an encrypted format, this is risky as the attacker can at the very least make a copy of the encrypted data for themselves and then go away and try and crack the encryption later on. Worse yet, if the attacker managed to insert themselves before an encrypted session got set up, well, then you've got an encrypted session with the hacker if you're the client or the server. Now, considering that the attacker does have the possibility of getting the data in clear text, they could also try and manipulate the data. that's an even worse risk, because now the attacker can dictate what information is being sent to the client or to the server. A very horrible situation. Now, what kind of systems would the attacker like to do this with? Well, the list is quite long, but one kind would be maybe getting in between you and your DNS server. Plus, a bunch of other possible DNS server attacks could be equally devastating, as the DNS server is going to dictate what a system communicates with. And if the attacker decides this is the IP address of a server or resource you want to communicate with, that could be very bad for you and me if we are the victims. So what kinds of approaches do the attackers like to use here? Well, first of all, attackers will try and go after public DNS servers wherever they can. The first and semi-legal method is to do something called typo squatting, where the attacker will register a very similar domain name to the victim and hope that people make a typo error while trying to go there. Possibly even paying to be a sponsored search result with a slight mistype on the domain name, as many people don't even pay attention to the URL that a search result from something like Google or Bing would take them to. And even though there's those that do, as long as the URL looks right at a glance, people generally don't read too closely. This is why many big organizations usually buy both their domain name they want to use and similarly typed ones, so that they can prevent people from typo squatting. Then we have a DDoS attack. With a DDoS attack, the attackers would probably target the DNS server on the internet, trying to take it down, and then impersonate it and give whatever answers they would like to the victims. It's a way of silencing the real DNS server and getting you to accept the response from there, back up, or failover, or very good impersonating DNS server. Also, the attackers could just look at hijacking a public DNS server. Now, with hijacking a public DNS server, this is actually a lot trickier than you would think, especially if people are using very well-known reputable public DNS registrars, such as Google, Cloudflare, and so forth. Usually the attackers who try and hijack DNS server control would probably be going after the smaller ISPs DNS servers, as they are probably less well secured, and also their security teams are probably less well equipped and experienced to deal with this. And if they can take over the genuine DNS server, anybody using it can then be misdirected and misguided to incorrect resources online. Or the attacker could just go after the individual records that they would like to mess with, leaving the other records alone. This is DNS poisoning. And one of the reasons why dynamic DNS, or DDNS, has fallen out of favor. DDNS allows a system to get a new public IP address and then inform a public DNS server about the new address so that the DNS record points to the new IP. That could possibly be very easily exploited for DNS poisoning attacks. Alternatively, the attacker might go for an on-path attack where they intercept the DNS queries, especially because DNS does tend to use UDP, making it very difficult to encrypt and secure. The attacker just needs to block the requests they want to tamper with and feed you with false information. For the DNS queries that they don't care about and the records they don't want to mess with, they could just pass through the genuine response. That's a big problem. Another big problem is that systems do client caching and have always done this, where a computer will normally keep a cached copy of a DNS record so that it doesn't need to keep querying the public DNS servers for the same IP over and over again. The attacker could gain access to the system either directly or through malware and change the details about that cached answer, again affecting the systems you want to talk with. Not a nice situation. We also have to worry about wireless attacks as well on our network, and the obvious one would be a rogue wireless access point. Now, with rogue wireless access points, these might be done accidentally in the form of shadow IT, where a user adds their own wireless access point to the network, either thinking they're clever by giving themselves their own wireless network link so that they don't have to share it with other users, or they're trying to be helpful to an organization that's got poorly performing Wi-Fi. Which is one of the reasons why I always tell people, try and make sure that your user access is done as well as possible so that your users are less likely to try and solve their own problems. But the problem with the users doing it themselves is they probably have not deployed that wireless access point with the correct security settings and controls that we would require on our enterprise wireless LAN. It gets worse though when the rogue wireless access point is intentional, or an evil twin as they're called. This is where an attacker has set up the fake rogue wireless access point themselves and will either mimic very closely or perfectly the SSID and other settings of your wireless infrastructure. The attackers might even go as far as trying to block the legitimate APs and then pretend to be the legitimate AP and gain control over the client's wireless link. It would make for a very effective on-path attack, one of which that the users would probably not be so cognizant or aware of. Then we've got the wireless denial of service attack as well. With a wireless denial of service attack, this is where the attackers have found a way to prevent your wireless network from working. This is usually going to be in the form of some sort of signal interference or signal jamming to make the network slow or non-responsive entirely. They could also look at doing wireless replay attacks, where they will try and intercept the traffic and replay it, hoping that they successfully trick the access point into authenticating and allowing them in and giving them access to your wireless infrastructure. From there, the attacker now has a point of ingress that they can start laterally moving from. Alternatively, instead of trying to replay the credentials, because that would only work with the older wireless encryption standards, they could try a more modern approach like a disassociation attack. With this, the attackers will usually send a wireless management frame called a disassociation request, which tells all clients to disassociate and reassociate with the access point. This is usually used to refresh the security and the shifting key that's used by modern encryption like WPA2. The benefit here for the attacker is usually within the first 14 packets will be the encrypted form of the passphrase, as well as the initialization vector used to cause a key shift to occur every so often. If the attacker can capture those first 14 packets, it makes their life a lot easier trying to crack the encryption and discover the passphrase and initialization vector so that they may now have access to. You know what? In some cases, the attackers might not even have to try this. They could maybe borrow some of the tools and techniques from password attacks to gain access to your Wi-Fi, in addition to actually learning what your password is for something. So with password attacks, we do have to concern ourselves with online and offline password attacks. With an online password attack, the attacker is usually going for the system that is using the password for some sort of authentication and access control. What the attacker gains from this is that as soon as they're successful, they are granted access. However, the attacker is exposing themselves as they are going to be trying to log into an active system. And if they're working too quickly, we can tell this is not a human, because there is no way that a human being is able to type something in, press enter, and get told access denied more than once every few seconds. So anything more frequent than that would be a machine doing it. So the attackers would then maybe consider taking a copy of your password in a secure form or something like that and try to crack it offline. That way they can have as many attempts per second as they like without drawing attention. And once the information is revealed, they can then use it. But either way, the attackers will want to try and figure out passwords, considering that they are one of the most popular authentication mechanisms and continue to be one of the most popular authentication mechanisms. And what will always work well is a brute force attack. This is where the attacker will try every combination of characters that could be used in a password. And the thing is, at the end of the day, that is all your password is really, a combination of characters. So eventually the attacker will succeed if they are using a brute force attack. The only question is, will they succeed in a day, in a week, a month, a year, or a decade? Because the longer it takes the attacker to bypass your password with a brute force, the less likely they are to try and use it. As your password is probably a lot less useful a year from now or even a decade from now than it is an hour or a day from now. So to try and speed it up a bit, attackers will usually use a dictionary attack, where they will use a list of common words, phrases, and names that are likely to be used by people for making memorable passwords. The good news is these dictionary lists are not super secretive, so you can get your hands on them and use them as a way to identify some bad password practices and maybe educate your users. Please be aware though, if you're thinking of trying to use words and phrases and names from other languages besides the one which you speak fluently and natively, be careful. There are password dictionary lists for most, if not all, spoken languages around the world. The only thing that will vary is how many of these dictionary lists exist for a given language. It does seem that English is one of the more popular languages to target for dictionary attacks. The dictionary definitely does decrease the time to success for the attacker, especially if some bad password practices are being followed. But the thing is, even implementing complexity will not solve every problem, because the attackers can hybridize brute force and dictionary, taking dictionary words and then complexifying them by substituting in common numbers and special characters that people tend to use instead of letters. For instance, the exclamation mark as the letter I, the @ symbol as the letter S, $, number 5 or number 2 for the letter S, and 0 for O are all very common mechanisms people tend to follow. And hybrid dictionary lists will use brute force logic to do that type of substitution, making for longer lists, but lists that are more likely to succeed as the words and phrases and names have received the common complexity logic that the average user would probably be following. And then we have password spraying. This is where attackers gain access to a credential dump, where an online platform like Facebook or LinkedIn or anything like that had their user databases compromised, and the attackers can now see your email address, possibly even some personally identifiable information, and have your password for that platform. The attackers will then try that same password on other platforms, including your workplace, as people tend to have the bad habit of reusing the same password over and over again. Which is one of the reasons why whenever you hear about a massive security breach for some of these online platforms where you may have an account, you want to be resetting your passwords anywhere and everywhere that has the same password as that account, so that the attackers will not succeed when attempting a password spray attack. Then, credential replays. With credential replay attacks, this is where the attackers are trying to intercept network authentication credentials or falsify them to gain access to network and domain accounts and what resources they may have access to. One of the earliest kinds of credential replay attacks that can still work is the pass the hash, as anything that uses NTLM or the New Technology Land Manager for network, file and folder sharing and resource sharing will use NTLM to share a hash credential. So for instance, if I was to try and access a shared folder on a server and it's asking me for a user account, if it's a SMB share and it's running in a work group or a domain, it just wants an account that the server recognizes as having the correct access. And whether I'm using a local account that the server knows of or a domain account, I could put my password in, my machine hashes it and passes the hash value across the network to the file share server that then grants me access. The attacker could potentially intercept that hash message and replay it, especially if one-time pins are not being used to prove that this hash message was transmitted before. Alternatively, the attackers could try and do a golden ticket attack. With a golden ticket attack, they are going after the Kerberos authentication service that is used by many domain controllers, most notably Microsoft's Active Directory. What happens here is the attackers gain access to a domain controller, which on its own is already very impressive, and they do a NTDS DIT dump, where they will expose everything, including the ticket signing ticket that Kerberos uses. This attack is very noticeable and will probably draw the attention of the security incident response team. The attacker has made a copy of that ticket signing ticket, and they are betting that the incident response team recovers everything, gets it back up and working, but does not reset the Kerberos server's ticket signing ticket. Now that the attacker has this, they can craft for themselves a ticket granting ticket that gives access to any and all applications with full administrative rights. And because they're using the copy of the ticket signing ticket that the domain currently uses, anything generated by it is immediately recognized as correct and authoritative. So you do want to make sure that your domain controllers are kept as secure as possible. Speaking of digital files granting access, there is also always the option for certificate theft when certificates are being used as a form of user authentication. Attackers can try and intercept, make copies, or even create their own false ones if they are able to compromise the certificate authority infrastructure, which is why I'm very cautious when advising people running their own internal digital certificates. By all means, it's wonderful as you control the process, but you definitely want to make sure that if you are running your own private certificate authority server, you are doing all the due diligences that a third-party public authority would be doing as well, which is expensive but definitely worthwhile if certificates are going to be used to grant access to things like systems, databases, or emails. Then we have network attacks against cryptography. This is where the attackers are trying to mess with the encrypted communications that we're doing. A very popular technique is to try and do what's called a downgrade attack, where the attacker will try and convince you to lower to a weaker cryptographic cipher suite. The good news is we can normally prevent this by telling a server, for example, to never go below a particular encryption standard when communicating via something like HTTPS. This will then prevent an attacker from getting an encrypted session to run at a lower, older, weaker standard that is more exploitable, while the user thinks that the HTTPS and the little padlock icon in their browser's URL bar is indicating that they are safe. The attackers could also try to take advantage of hash collision attacks. Hash collisions occur when two separate input values result in the same hash value on the output. This can be beneficial to the attacker, as a hash collision is likely to occur with some of the older hash values. And as hashing does get used quite a lot in validating encrypted communications, such as with digital signatures, as we spoke about in one of our previous videos, we now know that that could be very dreadful if separate values result in a hash collision. And this is made worse when the birthday condition is present. The birthday condition mainly applies to hashing, but it can affect some cryptographic ciphers as well. What happens with the birthday condition is it's a hash or key collision, in the case of cryptography, that results in different input values resulting in the same hash or cryptographic key. Cool. The number of permeations for this is surprisingly low. It's based on the premise that with a surprisingly small sample size of people, you can have two or more people that have the exact same birth date. The birthday paradox, or the birthday problem, according to mathematicians, states that you only need 23 people for the chance of two of them to have the same birth date exceed the probability of 50%. 23 people, and the chance of two of them having the same birthday is 50% is kind of crazy. And the number increases quite significantly. As you approach 60 people, your probability is pretty much guaranteed that two or more will have the same birth date. That is a surprisingly small number of people required. It's quite crazy, but it's the way mathematicians have determined this particular paradox to work. And applied to cryptography, it means that the possibility of two completely separate inputs resulting in the same hash value or cryptographic key being generated is surprisingly quite high. And it's one of the reasons why we're always moving towards longer based hash values and cipher keys for encryption. But besides this, we also need to worry a bit about malicious code indicators as well appearing through our network. So the first thing that we want to have our eyes open for will be shellcode indicators. This is normally a minimal kind of malware that's meant to exploit an application or an operating system to gain privileges. Shellcode attacks will normally then have some sort of open port for an attacker to access and send instructions to. Credential dumping malware is obviously, as we already said, going to make access and prepare for exfiltration of credentials for an attacker. And again, as these are likely to be done over the network, they are going to be transmitting the kinds of data that don't ordinarily go through the particular protocols and services that the data is going to be sent through. Persistence mechanisms used by the attackers will often also include things like malicious restore points or a long dormancy process to get into your backups, as we mentioned earlier with the ransomware. or messing around with the registry keys, as we spoke about with the Fileless Malware. Now, these persistence mechanisms are unlikely themselves to create any sort of network indicators, but whatever it is that they are trying to keep around will likely have some network indicators. So for instance, if you keep seeing shellcode indicators despite having resolved the previously detected incident, it might be that the shellcode attack has some sort of persistent capability that keeps occurring. And then you've also got scheduled tasks to automate and recreate the attack whenever needed, or to only run the attack or enable the vulnerability at particular times of the day, helping to have lower observable characteristics. Then a little bit on application attack indicators. So let's look at forgery attacks against some web applications and network applications. First up, we've got XSRF, or Cross Site Request Forgery. Please be aware they might abbreviate it to CSRF for the exam. Now, the way this attack works is you're going to have a user accessing some kind of network application server, like a web server. The user will sign in. The attacker comes along and sends to the victim a malicious link with a script included in the link, probably a PHP script. The user clicks the link, and then the link takes him to that site, and the malicious script is then able to run. That is how a cross-site request forgery works. What makes this quite damaging is that the cross-site request forgery is using the access the user currently has. This can be even worse if the user has an authentication cookie and they chose the Remember Me option on the website, assuming it supports that. And the action will appear to the server to have come from the user. We also have an SSRF, or a server-side request forgery. Now this happens a little bit differently. You're going to have a front-end server and a back-end server. A very common arrangement would probably be a front-end web server and a back-end database server. The attacker comes along and they want to access the database server more than likely. What they will then do is they will try and access that back-end database server, but because they're accessing it externally, they get rejected. The back-end server has probably been set up to only accept database requests, whether it be to read, write, or edit, or whatever, from the front-end web server. So what the attacker does is they find a way to do a malicious request to the front-end server. The front-end server, for whatever reason, is not going to verify or notice this request is malicious and pass it along. The back-end server, trusting the front-end server to have done the filtering, then sends the response, and that response gets relayed to the attacker. This is why front-end developers need to be as security conscious, if not more so, than back-end developers of applications. Then we have to worry about injection-based attacks. One of the most common network and web app-based injection attacks is a cross-site script. There are two main methods of doing this. A persistent cross-site script, where the attacker will gain access to the web server and embed their malicious code into the HTML of the website that will be served to any requesting users. Any users who receive that compromised code now will be running that malicious script and application in their browser, and the attacker gets what they want. The good news for us is this does require the attacker to access the web server and plant their malicious code there, which is going to draw our attention. Add to that as well, it's going to affect all the people that connect, and at some point someone will notice. So the volume of users affected is quite high, but also so is the probability that one of them will notice something and speak up. So to be a bit more subtle, they can try what's called a reflected attack. With a reflected attack, the attacker will be able to intercept and mess with genuine responses. To do this, the attacker will first get themselves a genuine response from the web server, and then take that and add their malicious code to it. Then they will wait for a victim to want to communicate with this genuine server, and once they see this victim doing that, they will respond as though they were the web server. If they are able to either block the genuine response or at least get their response to the victim before the genuine server, they will accept and run this malicious script, the victim here. And that allows the attacker to now mess with that person. This is a little bit harder to notice as the attacker is not affecting the entity that hosts the website, so that entity is going to get less insight and knowledge about their attacker working on them. The good news is, though, the volume of users affected is a lot smaller. The attackers could also try XML injection. With XML injection, the attacker is trying to add malicious XML files to whatever XML-based system is currently in use. As XML is used for so many different things, the possibilities are plentiful. Common techniques, though, that include tagged documents with a malicious XML reference, or XEE, XML external entities. Now, the external entity attack, the attacker will embed a request for a local resource. That local resource could then return the path to a local file. This could then show the attacker the contents of that local file if they are successful with this. After which, we also need to worry about LDAP injection attacks. Remember, LDAP is the protocol used to run a domain, and it's present in quite a few different domain controller services, ranging from Active Directory from Microsoft to OpenLDAP for Linux and other open source solutions. And if the attacker can successfully pull off an injection attack, they can either interfere with our domain schema or gain access and insight into how our domain is structured and organized. And then, as previously mentioned in the previous video, we have SQL injections, where the attacker can try and inject an SQL query onto a database. Usually this would be done through a front end, such as when we discussed moments ago, the server-side request forgery. Another interesting application-based attack is where the attacker tries to do a directory traversal. This is normally done when there is a network accessible directory or folder that the attacker can access. As most servers do make available some directory for access, the attacker just needs to connect using a different method other than the one prescribed. So for instance, trying to connect via FTP instead of through HTTP. And the attacker could then try and do a directory traversal attack. All they would need to do is initiate a cd command or change directory, and then try and do .. as that .. is normally a file system reference to parent directories or folders, if they were to try this in clear text. Thankfully, most modern services that do grant network directory access will normally have some sort of filter in place to prevent the .. file system reference. Attackers can try and get around this, though, by doing something called percentage encoding, where it's percentage number letter, and those percentage number letters normally correspond to particular characters, like %2f for the / and %2e for the dot. The percentage encoding can also be used for a variety of other things, such as command injection and script referencing in compromised URLs. Now, in the case of command injection, this is where the attacker pushes a command into that shared directory rather than trying to escape it. This does require the directory to have execute permissions applied, though, so as long as that is not present, the command is less likely to take place, depending on what the attacker is up to. But that is all I have for you in this video. If you haven't already done so, please like, please subscribe, and if you want to follow along with this whole series, save the playlist so you can go through it at your own leisure and also see when I bring up something new. If you would like to support the channel directly, I've got a link to my Patreon down below. And if you are more of a cryptocurrency fanatic, you can also drop me some cryptocurrency, either Bitcoin or Ethereum. My wallet addresses are included in the description below. But I would like to thank you for watching, and I would like to see you in the next video.